Before I begin this story, I want you to pause for just a moment. Think about your own life, your own dreams, and ask yourself one simple question. What would you do if the world told you no, over and over again? Would you give up? Or would you fight until the world had no choice but to listen? That's the story you're about to hear. And while you're here, do me one small favor. Subscribe right now for more powerful stories like this one, and comment below where you're watching from. Let's see just how far this message can travel, because ambition knows no borders. David was 24 years old. On the outside, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't born into wealth. He didn't have a famous last name that opened doors for him. To most people, he was just another young black man, trying to figure out life in a world that often dismissed people like him before they even had a chance to prove themselves. But David carried something inside him that most people around him didn't have. He carried vision. From the moment he opened his eyes each morning, his mind raced faster than his body could keep up. Where others saw routine, he saw possibilities. While his friends were busy applying for stable jobs, chasing monthly salaries, and trying to secure comfort, David's focus was somewhere entirely different. He wasn't interested in simply surviving. He wanted to build. He wanted to create. He wanted to leave behind something so powerful that even generations after him would feel its impact. Every morning, he woke up before the sun. His room was small, barely enough space to fit a bed and a worn-out desk pushed up against the wall. The paint on the walls was chipped. His chair wobbled every time he leaned back. The laptop he used was second-hand, bought from a pawn shop, with keys that stuck whenever he typed too fast. Yet none of that mattered. For David, that tiny desk was not just furniture. It was his launch pad. It was the place where he sketched the future. He filled notebook after notebook with drawings, plans, and ideas. His pen scratched across the pages until the ink ran dry. Some of the sketches looked messy, others more refined, but each one carried a piece of his vision. His eyes would light up as he explained his concepts to anyone who would listen, though most people didn't understand. They shrugged, nodded politely, and quickly changed the subject. But David didn't mind. He wasn't waiting for applause. He was waiting for the world to catch up. The truth is, David had no reason to believe he could succeed, not if you looked at his background. He wasn't rich. His family barely had enough to make ends meet. He didn't grow up in a neighborhood where dreaming big was encouraged. In fact, most people around him had already settled for less, long before they even had a chance to discover their true potential. They lived by the unspoken rule, play it safe. Don't take risks. Don't aim too high. But David couldn't silence the fire inside him. Every time he tried to ignore it, every time he thought of settling for a simple job just to quiet the noise, something in his chest burned hotter. It was as if his soul itself refused to let him settle. He would whisper to himself at night, "There has to be more than this. I was made for more." His friends didn't understand him. To them, David was wasting his time. "Bro, just get a normal job," they told him. "Secure a paycheck, stop stressing yourself. These dreams of yours, they don't pay bills." Their words stung, but David kept going. His relatives doubted him too. "You're too ambitious," they said. "Be realistic." He learned quickly that not everyone who loved him would believe in him. But even when doubt came from those closest to him, he held on to his belief. Because belief was all he had. Belief kept him awake at night, scribbling down new concepts under the dim glow of a flickering light bulb. Belief made him walk into libraries and spend hours reading about entrepreneurs, inventors, and world changers who had started from nothing, just like him. Belief made him save every spare coin, not for clothes, not for luxury, but for books, for internet access, for anything that could feed his mind. There were nights when David would lie awake staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by both excitement and fear. Excitement, because he knew he carried something powerful. Fear, because he knew he had no safety net. If he failed, there was nothing to fall back on. But every time fear rose, belief whispered louder, "Keep going. One day they will see." David's vision was not about money. He wasn't chasing luxury cars or flashy mansions. He dreamed of something deeper. He wanted to build a company that would reshape industries, provide jobs, and prove to people like him young, underestimated, and overlooked, that they could rise too. He wanted to create opportunities for those who had been told they weren't good enough. He wanted to inspire millions to dream bigger, to fight harder, and to believe in themselves even when no one else did. And that vision, it consumed him. He could see it so clearly in his mind that sometimes it scared him. The scale of what he wanted to achieve was enormous. But that's the thing about true vision, it should scare you. If your dream doesn't intimidate you, maybe it isn't big enough. David was no fool. He knew dreams alone wouldn't build an empire. He understood that discipline, persistence, and faith would be the real bricks that shaped his future. So, while others wasted time scrolling endlessly through their phones, David was building. While others partied, David studied. While others gave excuses, David searched for solutions. Every small step, every late night, every sacrifice became a silent investment into the future he believed in. He wasn't motivated by recognition. He wasn't waiting for validation. He was driven by hunger, the hunger to make his life count, the hunger to prove to himself that he wasn't just another statistic, another forgotten name. He wanted his existence to mean something. And so, he pressed on. Alone, but unshaken. David didn't know it then, but the road ahead would test him in ways he could never have imagined. It would strip him of his pride, crush him with rejection, and bring him face to face with despair. But in this moment, at the start of his journey, all he had was fire in his heart and the stubborn belief that he was built for greatness. And that was enough.
David's vision wasn't born overnight. It grew inside him like a seed planted years ago, when he was just a boy sitting on the cracked steps of his mother's house, watching neighbors come home from long shifts. Some looked tired, others defeated. He remembered asking his mom, "Why do people work so hard but still struggle so much?" She sighed, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Because the world doesn't always play fair. But maybe one day, someone like you will build something better." That memory never left him. It lived in his bones, in his heartbeat. Now, at 24, every late night felt like an answer to that childhood promise. His small desk was buried in notebooks with scribbled sketches, torn-out pages, and half-written plans. The glow of his old laptop lit up his tired eyes. While the city outside was asleep, David stayed awake, grinding, dreaming, building in silence. Sometimes he wondered if he was crazy. His friends laughed at him. "Man, why don't you just get a real job?" One of them joked. "You out here drawing pictures and chasing dreams like it's a movie." But David didn't care. Their words stung, but they couldn't kill his fire. Deep down, he knew something they didn't. History wasn't written by those who played it safe. Still, doubt had a way of creeping in at night. Alone in his room, he would stare at his reflection and whisper, "What if they're right? What if I'm wasting my time?" And then, almost like an echo from the past, he would hear his mother's voice in his memory. "The world doesn't always play fair. But maybe one day, someone like you will build something better." That single thought kept him alive. He lived simply, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. No fancy car, no expensive clothes, no steady paycheck. Just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Every spare dollar went into chasing his idea. While others spent money at clubs, David invested in books, software, and the tools he needed to create. His vision became his oxygen. He woke up thinking about it. He fell asleep dreaming about it. It was no longer just an idea, it was a calling. And when people mocked him for dreaming too big, David smiled. Because he knew he wasn't chasing money. He was chasing impact. He wanted to build something so powerful, so groundbreaking, that one day the same people who laughed at him would look back and say, "I should have believed in him." But for now, all he had was a dream, a stack of notebooks, and a fire that refused to die.
David's fire might have burned out quickly if not for a man named Mr. Carter. Carter was nothing like David. Where David was restless and hungry, Carter was calm and seasoned, with a kind of presence that filled a room without him saying a word. He was a retired businessman, someone who had built, lost, and rebuilt again. The kind of man who carried invisible scars, not on his skin, but in his eyes. They met by accident, or at least that's what David thought. One late evening, after yet another long day of sketching ideas, David found himself in a small cafe, pitching his dream to a stranger at the next table. His words poured out in a flood of excitement, but the stranger wasn't really listening. He nodded politely, then checked his watch and left. But someone else had been listening, Mr. Carter. From the corner of the cafe, the older man had observed the young dreamer, noticed the fire in his voice, the way his hands moved like he was sculpting the future out of thin air. When David finally sat back down, deflated and embarrassed, Carter walked over and set his coffee on the table. "You talk like a man who believes he can change the world," Carter said. David looked up, surprised. "I have to believe it. If I don't, who will?" Carter studied him for a moment, then smiled. That was the beginning. Over the next weeks, Carter became something David never had before, a mentor. Not the type who handed out easy praise, but the type who told the truth, even when it stung. One evening, as David paced around Carter's living room, pitching his idea for the 100th time with restless excitement, Carter leaned back in his chair and finally interrupted him. "Your idea is good," Carter said slowly. "But good ideas are everywhere. What makes a man succeed is not the idea, it's his persistence." David frowned. "But isn't the idea everything?" Carter shook his head. "No, son. An idea without resilience is just a dream. The world will tell you no 100 times before it ever says yes. The question is, can you keep going when every door slams in your face?" Those words etched themselves into David's soul. They felt less like advice and more like prophecy. Armed with confidence and his mentor's guidance, David decided it was time to step out of his notebooks and into the real world. He walked into his first investor meeting, heart pounding, hands sweaty but determined. His suit was borrowed from a cousin. His pitch deck was basic, slides printed on cheap paper and clipped together. But his smile was unstoppable. The room was cold, sterile, with glass walls and sharp suits. Across the table sat a man who barely looked up from his phone as David introduced himself. David launched into his pitch, his voice trembling at first but then finding rhythm. He spoke of impact, of innovation, of building something that would reshape industries. His words flowed with passion, but passion alone couldn't hide the inexperience in his delivery. Within 5 minutes, the investor cut him off. "Thank you, but this isn't what we're looking for." No questions. No feedback. Just dismissal. The meeting was over before it had even begun. David gathered his papers slowly, trying to mask the sting. As he walked out, his chest felt heavy, his mind racing with doubts. For a moment, he wanted to believe maybe his friends were right. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this. But then he remembered Carter's words. The world will tell you no 100 times before it ever says yes. The question is, can you keep going? David stepped into the evening air, head lowered, but inside his chest, the fire still flickered. It wasn't a roaring flame, not yet. But it refused to die. That night, he sat at his desk, rejection letter still crumpled in his bag, and whispered to himself, "If one man won't believe in me, I'll find another. And if they all say no, I'll build it myself." The lesson had been planted. The storm was coming. But David was learning how to stand in the rain. David thought he was ready. After nights of rehearsing his pitch in front of a cracked mirror, after borrowing a second-hand suit from his cousin that didn't quite fit his shoulders, and after polishing his borrowed shoes until he could see his reflection, he believed this was the day everything would begin. The bank's lobby smelled of fresh leather and cold marble, and the receptionist barely looked up when he signed in. His hands trembled as he clutched the thin folder carrying his business plan, his dream, compressed into neat bullet points and projected numbers. "Next," a voice barked, and David stepped in. The man behind the desk barely glanced at the proposal before pushing it back. "We don't fund unproven ideas, especially from someone with no track record. Try again once you've built a real business." It was over in 3 minutes. No debate. No questions. Just dismissal. David walked out slowly, as if each step was heavier than the last. He clutched his folder against his chest like a shield that had already failed him. Outside, the sun blazed, but inside him, everything felt dim. But this was only the first no. Over the next weeks, David knocked on every door he could find. Startup competitions. angel investors, community leaders, big corporations, small business loan offices. Some listened long enough to laugh at him, telling him his idea was too ambitious for someone like you. Others cut him off mid-sentence, glancing at their phones, uninterested in hearing his passion. And some didn't even hide their disdain. One investor leaned back, smirked, and said, "Son, people like you don't build billion-dollar companies. You should try for a regular job. Leave the big dreams to others." The words cut deep. They weren't just saying no to his idea. They were saying no to him. Night after night, David tossed in bed, staring at the ceiling. His small apartment grew colder, emptier. The unpaid bills stacked on the counter like silent reminders of failure. His phone buzzed with messages from friends, pictures of their new jobs, promotions, engagements, while he sat alone, holding onto a vision that seemed more foolish with every rejection. At times, he wanted to give in, to fold the papers, close the laptop, and accept the world's verdict. He wasn't good enough. His idea wasn't good enough. Maybe the investors were right. Maybe he was chasing something impossible. But then, Mr. Carter's voice would echo in his mind. The mentor had seen it all before. Failure, doubt, the crushing weight of rejection. And he had told David once, in the quiet calm of his study, rejection is not the end, it's the test of your belief. So David dragged himself up each morning, even with his stomach empty, even when the walls felt like they were closing in. He rehearsed his pitch again, refining, adjusting, sharpening the words. He told himself, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next door. But with each door slammed in his face, the cracks inside him grew wider. The 10th rejection, the 20th, the 35th, each one carving away at his confidence. By the 50th, even Mr. Carter's encouraging words felt like they were fading. One night, David returned from another humiliating meeting. The investor hadn't even let him sit down. Just glanced at his suit, smirked, and waved him out. David collapsed onto his couch, his head buried in his hands. For the first time, tears burned down his face. He wasn't crying just from rejection. He was crying from the weight of being unseen, unheard, unvalued. "Why does no one believe in me?" he whispered to the empty room. Silence answered back. And yet, somewhere deep inside, the flame flickered. Weak, trembling, but not dead. Because in the distance, he remembered Carter's words again. "Can you keep going when the world tells you no?" David wiped his tears. His voice cracked as he spoke to himself. "I will." But as he stared at the calendar on the wall, counting the mounting rejections, 60, 70, 80, he couldn't shake the question. How many more before he finally broke? David's nights grew longer. Sleep came only in fragments, haunted by the echoes of voices telling him no. Sometimes he dreamed of standing before crowds, his idea celebrated, his company alive, only to wake up to the cold sting of reality. A stack of unpaid bills. An empty fridge. Silence pressing against the walls. And still, he pushed forward. On a rainy afternoon, he found himself standing in the lobby of a sleek glass building, water dripping from his shoulders. He had waited weeks for this meeting with a prestigious firm. He believed, no, he hoped, this was the one. Inside, the room was filled with polished men in tailored suits. David stood before them, his slides shaky, his voice trembling but passionate. He laid out the vision. How his idea could revolutionize the way people worked, how it could spark opportunities not just for himself but for thousands. When he finished, there was silence. Then laughter. One of the men leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Young man, do you know how many people walk in here with the next big idea? Every week, every month, we hear the same speeches. You're just another dreamer. Come back when you have something real, if you survive that long." They chuckled as David gathered his papers. He bowed slightly, more out of habit than respect, and left. Outside, the rain masked the tears that slipped from his eyes. The humiliation ate at him. It wasn't just rejection anymore. It was ridicule. The number climbed. 70 rejections. 75. 80. Each one heavier than the last. His friends began to whisper. Some urged him to give up. Others told him he was wasting his youth. Even his family grew restless, reminding him that rent and food didn't pay themselves. But every time David faltered, Mr. Carter's presence steadied him. The old man would invite him over, pour him tea, and listen. He never sugar-coated things. "David," he said one evening, "success doesn't come to those who avoid rejection. It comes to those who outlast it. The question isn't how many no's you can take. The question is, can you hold on to your belief until the one yes arrives?" David nodded, but his heart felt heavier than his words. One evening, broke and exhausted, he stood in front of a mirror. His reflection was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his eyes bloodshot. He barely recognized the man staring back. "Maybe they're right," he whispered. "Maybe this dream isn't for me." But then he remembered the first sketches he had drawn in his notebook years ago. The vision that had consumed him. The fire that had driven him to knock on doors, again and again. "No," he muttered. "I can't quit. Not yet." The 90th rejection came. Then the 95th. Each no was like a hammer against his spirit. But strangely, each no also began to harden him. The sting remained, but so did the stubbornness. Where once he cried after rejections, now he clenched his jaw and walked taller. By the 100th rejection, David no longer trembled. He no longer begged them to see his worth. Instead, he looked them in the eye, steady and unflinching, and thought to himself, "One day, you'll regret turning me down." And though he left that final meeting with another no ringing in his ears, this time, the fire in his chest burned brighter than ever. Because by now, David had learned the truth. Rejection wasn't the end. It was preparation. And his journey was only just beginning. David's life felt like it was unraveling piece by piece. Rejections weren't just bruises on his dream anymore, they were scars on his soul. By the time the 100th company had slammed the door, his savings were gone. The money he borrowed from friends had dried up. His landlord had given him a final warning. And his fridge, it was almost always empty. Nights became the worst. That's when silence was loudest, when bills sat heavy on the table, and when his doubts screamed the most. He would lie on the floor of his tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, whispering, "What if they're right? What if this dream was never mine to hold?" There were moments he almost quit. Moments when he pictured himself abandoning it all and taking a job, any job. Just to silence the hunger, the shame, the constant weight pressing down on his chest. One evening, he walked through the city streets with nothing but a wrinkled folder in his hands. He watched people dressed in fine clothes stepping out of expensive cars. Couples laughing as they walked into restaurants. Families carrying shopping bags. And in that moment, David felt invisible. Forgotten. Small. But then came the breaking point. His landlord showed up at his door, furious. "You're 2 months behind, David. I can't keep waiting. You've got a week to come up with the money or you're out." That night, David sat alone in the dark. No electricity. Just the faint glow of the streetlight sneaking through the blinds. His chest tightened. His hands shook. For the first time, he felt the crushing temptation to give up. To stop fighting. To let the dream die. But then, his phone buzzed. It was Mr. Carter. "Come see me tomorrow," the message read. "I've got something for you." The next morning, David showed up at Carter's house, broken but still breathing. The old man looked at him and saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of 100 rejections pressing down. "Sit," Carter said gently. David collapsed into the chair. "I don't know if I can keep going. I've tried everything. No one believes in me. Maybe I was foolish to think I could do this." Carter leaned forward. His voice was calm, but his words carried fire. "David, every man who ever built something great has stood where you stand now. At the edge of quitting. At the breaking point. That's where the test comes. Not when doors open, but when every single one slams shut. If you stop now, all the pain you've endured will mean nothing. But if you push one more time, that could be the moment everything changes." Then Carter placed a small, worn notebook on the table. "I kept this when I started my business decades ago. Inside are lessons, mistakes, and strategies. It's not money I can give you. But this knowledge, it might just save you." David opened the notebook. Inside were scribbles, quotes, numbers, stories of failure and recovery. Each page was proof that even Carter had once been rejected, humiliated, nearly broken, and yet he survived. That night, David sat with a notebook under a flickering light. He read page after page until the words began to sink in. For the first time in months, hope flickered again inside him. One lesson stood out, etched in bold ink. Failure is the tuition you pay for success. The words echoed in his mind, louder than the voices of doubt. He grabbed his old notebook, the one filled with his own sketches and plans, and began rewriting his vision. He refined his pitch, simplified his design, sharpened his story. This wasn't just about chasing money anymore. It was about resilience, about proving to himself that he could rise. The hunger in his stomach didn't fade. The bills didn't vanish. The world hadn't suddenly become easier. But David's spirit had shifted. Because now, he wasn't just a dreamer who wanted to be heard. He was a fighter who refused to stay silent. And though he didn't know it yet, the very rejection that nearly destroyed him was about to become the foundation for something greater than he ever imagined. David had stopped counting at 99. 99 rejections. 99 slammed doors. 99 voices telling him he wasn't ready, that his idea was foolish, that he should give up and find something safe. But something inside him refused to die. That morning, the morning of his 101st meeting, David stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the same worn-out suit he had borrowed from his cousin. The fabric was fraying at the edges, the color fading from too many wears. Yet to him, it was armor. He stared at his own reflection. His eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. His face was leaner, his shoulders tense. But beneath the exhaustion was fire. He whispered to himself, as if summoning every ounce of strength left in his bones. Persistence is greater than rejection. Mr. Carter's words echoed in his soul like a drumbeat. The old man was gone now. His health had faded months earlier, but his wisdom lived on in David's chest. When David walked into that sleek office lobby, he felt like the underdog walking into the lion's den. The walls were glass, the air smelled like money. Investors in expensive suits brushed past him, barely giving him a glance. His palms were sweating. His heart raced. The receptionist eyed him suspiciously, as if she had seen 1,000 dreamers like him before, and most of them never returned. "Name?" she asked. "David Okoro," he said, voice firm despite the storm inside. She clicked through her screen, then finally nodded. "You have 15 minutes. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to prove that 100 people were wrong. 15 minutes to rewrite his story." He sat in the waiting room, clutching his presentation slides, the same slides that had been mocked, ignored, or tossed aside before. His fingers brushed over the paper edges, almost worn thin from use. Then, the door opened. "Mr. Okoro, you may come in." David rose, every step into that room feeling heavier than the last. The investor, a tall man in a navy blue suit, sat behind a massive oak desk. His eyes were sharp, skeptical, the kind that had crushed many young entrepreneurs before. "All right," the investor said, glancing at his watch. "You've got my attention. Let's hear it." David took a deep breath. He began to speak. Not like the nervous young man who had stuttered through dozens of failed meetings, but like a man who had been forged in fire. His voice was steady, his passion raw. He didn't just pitch a product. He told a story of why this idea mattered. A story of how it could reshape an industry that had grown stale. A story of millions of people who could be impacted, jobs that could be created, futures that could be rewritten. For the first time in a long time, the investor didn't cut him off. He didn't check his phone. He leaned forward. "Tell me more," the man said. David's heart skipped. This wasn't dismissal. This wasn't mockery. This was interest. For nearly an hour, the two spoke. David explained the flaws in the current system, painted a vivid picture of the future, and laid out the plan that had consumed him for years. The investor challenged him, pushed him, asked hard questions. And for every question, David had an answer, not because he had rehearsed lines, but because he had lived this vision day and night. When the meeting finally ended, David stood still, waiting for the familiar sting of rejection. But instead, The investor extended his hand. "I'll take a chance on you," he said. "Let's build this together." The words hit David like thunder. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His legs felt weak. His eyes burned. He wanted to shout, to cry, to fall on his knees. But he forced himself to remain composed. He shook the man's hand firmly. "Thank you," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "You won't regret this." That night, David walked through the city streets in silence. The world around him hadn't changed. The same cars, the same noise, the same neon lights flickering. But to him, everything was different. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. For the first time in years, someone had said, yes. And that, yes, became the seed of something extraordinary. With the investor's backing, David finally had the resources to bring his idea to life. The product, once a dream sketched on napkins and notebook pages, was now being built in a small office with a handful of believers who joined his mission. Days turned into nights, and nights into days. The struggle wasn't over. Far from it. There were still challenges, mistakes, setbacks. But this time, rejection wasn't the end. This time, he had momentum. The first prototype failed. But they rebuilt. The second version flopped. But they refined. The third showed promise. And then came the breakthrough moment. The product launched quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A few customers, a few reviews. But word spread. People saw the difference. They felt the impact. They believed. Orders started rolling in. Investors who had once laughed at David's idea were now calling, desperate to be part of it. Companies that had ignored him began sending partnership offers. Banks that had rejected him wanted to provide credit. David remembered every single one of those no's. He remembered the slammed doors, the mocking laughter, the pitying looks. And now, each new yes felt like a victory not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Months passed, then years. The company grew, fast. What started with a single chance became a movement. David's product didn't just succeed, it disrupted an entire industry. It created thousands of jobs, inspired millions, and turned David from a dreamer into a leader. But through it all, he never forgot that morning of his 101st meeting. The worn-out suit. The trembling hands. The words he had whispered to himself. Persistence is greater than rejection. That was the day everything changed. That was the day his fire finally set the world alight. The years had passed like a blur. David stood backstage, waiting for his cue. The noise outside was overwhelming. Thousands of employees, partners, and supporters packed into a massive auditorium, celebrating the company's 10th anniversary. 10 years. A decade ago, he had been sleeping on a thin mattress in a cramped room, barely able to pay for food, wondering if rejection would crush him forever. Now, he was the founder of a billion-dollar empire, a company that had reshaped industries, created thousands of jobs, and become a symbol of what relentless persistence could achieve. As he adjusted his suit, no longer the faded hand-me-down, but a custom-tailored one, David felt a lump rise in his throat. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Everyone who had ever been rejected, dismissed, or underestimated. The stage manager whispered, "You're on in 10. David closed his eyes for a moment. And just like that, he was back in that tiny apartment, staring at his cracked ceiling, whispering Mr. Carter's words into the silence. Persistence is greater than rejection. When he finally stepped onto the stage, the applause thundered through the hall. Thousands rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, smiling. Faces lit up with admiration, not just for the man, but for the story he represented. David raised his hand gently, and the noise quieted. His voice, calm but firm, carried across the hall. 10 years ago, he began, I was a man with nothing but an idea. I walked into offices with my heart in my hands, begging people to see what I saw. And one by one, they turned me away. 100 times. 100 doors closed in my face. The room was silent. People leaned forward, hanging on every word. I almost gave up. I almost believed them when they told me I wasn't ready, that I wasn't good enough, that my dream was impossible. But then I remembered something my mentor told me, something that saved me. He said, "Persistence is greater than rejection." And I carried those words into every room, every meeting, every sleepless night. Until finally, someone said yes. He paused, letting the words sink in. His eyes scanned the crowd, many of whom had tears glistening. "That one yes," he continued, "was all it took. One yes changed everything. And today, we stand together, not just as a company, but as proof that dreams don't die just because others can't see them. Proof that rejection is not the end, it is the test of your belief." The hall erupted in applause again. But David wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer, more intimate. "If there's one thing my journey has taught me, it's this: don't let rejection define you. Let it refine you. Every no is just a step closer to the yes that will change your life. Rejection isn't failure, it's training. It's the world asking you, do you believe in this enough to keep going? And if your answer is yes, then nothing can stop you." He smiled, shaking his head slightly, remembering the darkest days. To those of you struggling right now, with bills, with doubt, with the voices telling you to quit, hear me, you are not alone. I was there. And the pain you feel today can become the foundation of your greatest victory tomorrow. Hold on. Keep moving. Believe, even when no one else does. The applause returned, louder than before, echoing like thunder. But David wasn't just giving a speech. He was handing over a lesson, the kind that would stay in hearts long after the lights went down. Rejection taught me patience. It taught me humility. It taught me to sharpen my vision until it was undeniable. And most importantly, rejection taught me that success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. He looked toward the front row, where the original investor, the man who had given him his first chance, sat smiling proudly. David nodded at him. To the one person who believed when no one else did, thank you. You showed me that one open door can outweigh 100 closed ones. The hall stood again, cheering and clapping, a wave of energy washing over him. But as the noise roared, David whispered under his breath, so quietly only he could hear, "Mr. Carter, we did it. You were right. Persistence is greater than rejection." That night, as the celebrations went on and music filled the air, David slipped away from the crowd for a moment of solitude. He stood on the balcony overlooking the city skyline, its lights shimmering like stars. And he reflected on the lessons his story carried, not just for him, but for everyone willing to listen. Lesson 1: Rejection is not the end. It's a filter that tests who truly believes in their dream. Lesson 2: You only need one yes. Don't let 100 no's stop you from finding it. Lesson 3: Persistence is the bridge between failure and success. Without it, dreams collapse. With it, even the impossible becomes possible. Lesson 4: The journey shapes you more than the destination. Every hardship prepares you for the weight of success. Lesson 5: Believe louder than the world doubts. Your belief is the fuel that makes the vision real. He smiled. These were not just business lessons, they were life lessons. Lessons forged in the fire of rejection. Lessons that had turned a struggling dreamer into a builder of legacies. David whispered into the night, "If I could do it, so can they." And now, as you listen to his story, ask yourself, what dream have I been too afraid to chase? What rejection has broken me? Remember, rejection is not your enemy. It is the test. And your persistence is the answer. If David's story inspired you, if it lit a fire in you, if it reminded you that failure is not final, then don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button and like this video, because more stories like this are waiting for you. Stories of persistence, of resilience, of ordinary people who refused to quit until the world had no choice but to notice them. Because your story could be the next one we tell. So stay with us, believe with us, and never forget, persistence is greater than rejection. Thank you.